The first is that a large part of what we're discussing today has to do with Western travel logs. Now, some people may say, well, why Western travel logs? You know, why American and British missionaries? They were obviously very biased, towards Assyrians. They were, and we'll see expressions of that. They were motivated by religious zeal rather than a desire to obtain information, accurate information. They weren't really scientific in their study. Keep in mind that this is really all we have. We don't have much in terms of Assyrian reflection on the age that we're talking about. We're really talking about Western sources because we rely on them heavily because we just don't have any other sources. Now, what do we have from the perspective of the Assyrians is lore, cultural lore. We have also some Assyrian sources that are written in the 20th century that reflect back, based on oral history, reflect back on this period. And then finally, we have some Ottoman documents. Now, do we have documents that we have not come across? Of course. I think it's important to look, for example, at Ottoman documents very carefully. It's important to look at Qajar documents, Iranian documents. It's important to look at Russian documents altogether and kind of do a very careful study. This is going to take a very long time, but history is, not simply looking at something that is dead. It's something that is constantly moving and developing, and there's more information about certain things. So what we thought we knew turns out that was possibly either inaccurate or there's much more to know. So I am going to refer to these Western sources, but I'm going to stop and remind you that here's something which may be unreasonable. This assessment may be unreasonable. Other assessments are extremely reasonable, and they seem to be very accurate. So, for example, there's a reference to the character of Assyrians as being overly litigious and very oriented towards conflict with each other. Well, this is the observation of one person. The evidence may be anecdotal. Do not take this as kind of an expression of the entirety of the Assyrian people. So you have to place it within the proper context. So I'll try to remind us of the biases or the particular perceptions that missionaries or Westerners had. And so to keep in mind kind of a comprehensive and overall perspective on what is going on in terms of the accuracy of these reports, it's important to keep in mind that some people had their biases, but what they were observing, could have been true in that particular case, but again, it's anecdotal. It's not really a reflection of all or the entirety of the Assyrian people or any particular group of people or even an entire village or family. So with that, let us begin. Today's lecture is going to be on the independent Assyrian tribes. And we're largely talking about, as we mentioned last time, the Tiari, Upper and Lower Tiari, the Tchuma, the Jilu, the Baz, and the Diz. These are the 5 so-called Ashirat tribes, and Ashirat is a term also used in Arabic from Ashair or Ashirats, also in Persian and Turkish. This means really that these are tribal people and they are largely outside of the very strong governmental jurisdiction. So they have nominal jurisdiction or nominal power over the independent Assyrian tribes. And notice that I I place the word independent in partial quotes for a reason. Well, why is that? Because they weren't fully independent in the sense that they were on their own and forming their own foreign policy and so on and so forth. That was not the situation. Neither were they financially independent or economically independent in the true sense of the word, or administratively independent, but they were largely left to their own. They had a strong sense of autonomy, and this also had an impression on the culture of the Assyrian mountaineers specifically, or the tribes. Now, the history of the Assyrian mountaineers is intertwined with the West during this period. It is the time that the West encounters, and some people use the word discovers, the Assyrians. I hate the use of this word. I don't think it's appropriate, obviously. Nobody discovered the Assyrians. The Assyrians were there, of course. So we tend to use this word in quote marks, Westerners who discovered, quote unquote, the Assyrians. So the tribal history, or the independent tribes, really during this period, their history is intertwined with Western action and Western intervention, and also with the conflict between various sides. So conflict between the Russians and the Ottomans, conflict between the Kurdish Emirates, to which I referred, but I will go into more detail as to what the Emirates were, the Kurdish Emirates specifically, or the Confederation of Emirates, and specifically in the Hakkari. And so this conflict between these various sides, between, on the one hand, if we look to the west, it's the Ottomans. If we look to the east, it's the Qajars. If we look to the north, it's the Russians, and so on. And if we look around the Assyrians, specifically the people in Hakkari, the Ashirats, the tribes, the independent tribes, we see the Kurds. And so there is constant source of friction, not always, but many times sources are created because there is friction and there is conflict. That makes for a good story, an interesting story, a tragic story. So oftentimes we really see a record of the events concerning the Assyrians when there is a great deal of conflict. So we have here a quote by William Ainsworth that I think is important to reflect on. There was an interest taken in the Assyrians as kind of a unique people, a unique remnant of an ancient Christian church that everyone sought to either assist, or stated so, or sought to control and to keep away from, for example, the other side. So American missionaries, Anglican missionaries, American missionaries who were Protestant were obsessed with keeping the Assyrians away from what they called the papists, the Catholics. On the other hand, the Catholic missionaries were concerned about the ruinous influence that the American and Anglican missionaries may have had. And so back and forth. Now, it just so happened, of course, that during this time, the Assyrians in the Hakkari area and the Urmi area were members of the Church of the East that was independent or not allied to Rome. So it was not a part of the Uniate Church. However, Assyrians who were in the Nineveh plain were allied to Rome and were part of the Uniate Church. So the Assyrians living in the Nineveh plain were Catholic, and we refer to them as Chaldean, although, as I have said repeatedly in this class, the word Chaldean really referred to everyone, rightly or wrongly, and you can ask questions about this later. But the word Chaldean referred to everyone, the word Assyrian referred to everyone, the word Syrian referred to everyone. It's just that people were classified during this time. We're talking about the 18th century, not according to political parties or political affiliation. They were really referred to as this or that sect or church denomination. So Westerners took a great deal of interest in this ancient remnant of Christianity, which they thought they idealized as kind of a pure Christianity that was untouched by influences of the West and the influences even of Muslims. And so they longed to make contact with these ancient Christians and were obsessed to come and meet these Assyrians on top of the world, as it were, in these high places. So Ainsworth tells us this sudden interest, so explicitly and so actively shown on the part of other Christian nations toward a tribe of people, has called the Assyrians, has called them forth into new importance in the eyes of the Muslims. And I'm going to clarify this at the end of this quote, because this is really a prelude of things to come. Ainsworth is writing in the 1840s. Very ominous things are going to come in the future. And this will, he tells us, undoubtedly be the first step to their overthrow, unless they are assisted in such an emergency by sound advice or the friendly interference of the representatives of brotherly Christian nations at Constantinople. It will be the most cruel thing imaginable to have excited so much attention from surrounding powers towards the condition of these people, courageous and pious mountaineers, only to leave them to the tender mercies of Islam. What does that mean? Well, first of all, I want to tell you that part of what we're doing here is taking a survey before we get into a very important part of Assyrian history. What's coming next is the conflicts of 1843 and 1846 between the Assyrians and the Kurdish Emirates, specifically between Nur Allah, who is the Emir of the Hakkari, and Badr Khan Bey, who is the Emir of Botan. This conflict is going to set the trend of where Assyrians are going to be going. And when we say Assyrians, we're talking about the mountain Assyrians specifically, but really all Assyrians. Why are we focused on the mountain Assyrians? Again, the independent Assyrian tribes had been the most powerful element of the Assyrian people. So among people in Urmiya, among people in Tur Abdin, among people in the Nineveh Plain, for example, the Hakkari Assyrians were different, distinguished. They were set apart in a way because they had arms and they were able to protect themselves, unlike the people in the Nineveh Plain, the people in Urmiya, the people in Tur Abdin, and so on. So this concern that Ainsworth expresses is really talking about what's going to happen in the future in 1843 and 1846 specifically, that is going to change the future of the Assyrian existence in the mountains. And we will go back and forth, and I'm going to quote from some of the missionaries who described the situation in 1890. And I want you to think about what happens between the visits of, for example, Eli Smith, Reverend Eli Smith, and his partner into the Hakkari in 1830, and then the descriptions given by one Isabella Bird in 1890 and afterwards, how she describes the horrible situation and reading her account of what she saw among Assyrians, specifically in the Urmiya plain, in the plain of Gawar and other places, but also in the Hakkari area, really is horrible to read and extremely tragic. And one comes away thinking, boy, that life is extremely, extremely difficult for the Assyrians. So in 1890, Isabella describes that in her last letter, she remarked upon the prosperity. And this is what we have to remember. The Urmiya plain unlike the Hakkari area, was very prosperous in terms of agriculture. It had, now these are estimates, and I've been asked before, concerning these estimates of Assyrians, what are the numbers? It's 20,000 Assyrian, although she uses Syrian. I inserted the word Assyrian here for a reason. Inhabitants usually live in separate villages from the Kurds. So what she's talking about is that there is a smaller group of Assyrians living in the city of Urmiya, but around the city are various villages of Assyrians, multiple Assyrian villages. And the Assyrians live separately, although side by side with Persians, Armenians. Really what she means is Azaris, Armenians, and are surrounded on all sides by Muslims of the Shia sect. Well, what was their situation like in terms of their lifestyle, their ability to earn an income, their daily lives? The landlords, she tells us, or Aghas in their villages are generally Muslims who govern their tenants in something of feudal style. Land is a favorable investment in Iran, and owing to the industrious habit of the Assyrians, the Aghaship of the villages commands a high price. The Aghas often oppress the peasants, but the tenure of houses is fairly secure. And according to Canon MacLean, to whom I am indebted for my information, a system much like the Scotch feudal system is in force. If a man wishes to build a house, he takes a present of a few sugar loaves or a few crowns with him and applies to the Agha for a site. So what she's telling us is there's a official system of bribes of these Aghas, and depending on the particular Agha that you're dealing with, you could get a good deal or a very horrible deal. This is the situation in Urmi in 1890. And a little sketch of Isabella birth so that you're familiar with her birth date, 1831 to 1904. She was married, her married name was Bishop, 19th century British explorer, writer. She was a photographer and naturalist, and her descriptions of the Hakkari are spectacular, as well as Urmiya. She has a knack for describing persons, really overuses the word handsome and beautiful a lot, but she has a good knack for describing scenery, describing people, their features, something that, say, for example, the male missionaries don't do. So I found that very interesting. And her journal is called Journeys into Persia and Kurdistan in 1891. And this book, by the way, is quoted extensively by one Gordon Taylor, which I will refer to in the next lecture when I talk about the conflict with between the Assyrians and Badr Khan and Nur Allah. Gordon Taylor has written a very interesting book, keeping you on the edge, as it were, almost reads like a mystery novel. But I think it's ultimately, and I will comment on it, a very unfair book towards the Assyrians and very judgmental towards the decisions made. But I will leave that for the next time. But he quotes extensively from Isabella Bird. Another two people that visited the Hakkari, and I think it's very important to read their works, are Reverend Smith and Reverend Dwight, who visited from the east coast of the United States. There you see Reverend Smith, Eli Smith, with his wife. And they wrote something called Researches of the Reverend Smith and Reverend Dwight in Armenia, including a journey through Asia Minor and into Georgia and Persia, with a visit to the Nestorian and Chaldean Christians of Urmiya and Salamis, published in 1833, based on their visit in 1830. Now, what are the geographic features of what these missionaries saw that was different between the Assyrians living in the plains and the Assyrians living in the Hakkari Mountains? Hakkari is a very rugged area with little agricultural output. The Nineveh Plain, by contrast, and Urmiya, Salamis, Suldus, and Tur Abdin have higher agricultural output. Gorabdin is slightly more hilly or mountainous, but it is not as rugged as, say, the Hakkari Mountains. And here's a beautiful quote by the Reverend Frederick Cohen, Yesterdays in Persia and Kurdistan. One wonders how any human beings can live in such bare, wild places, and yet in these almost inaccessible fastnesses. For fit for the home of the wild eagle and bear have lived for many centuries the hardy, brave Assyrian tribes who fled centuries ago to escape extermination by the Muslims. This idea that the Assyrians fled persecution was written by several authors, most predominantly Badger and Budge, who refer to the Assyrian flight into the mountains based on the coming of Tamerlane and later other Islamic rulers. And that may have been in part true, although there is evidence to suggest that there was life here, Assyrian life here, earlier than that, earlier than the time of Tamerlane. Here, with infinite toil and industry, they, the Assyrians, have built tiny fields that rise like terraces up the sides of the mountain. One cannot but admire the skill shown where only crude tools they have, by means of wall and tunnel, carried the water well up the mountainside to water the small fields. I have never seen a place where anyone works harder and gets less for it than the Hakkari area. They themselves have a saying, Mia qarile, khayy marile, cold water, bitter life. And yet how passionately they love these bare rocks, for here they have maintained their independence. Again, this reference to independence, different, of course, from what the missionaries and other travelers saw in, for example, Urmi and Hakkari and the Nineveh Plain and other areas. And we have descriptions of how beautiful the Hakkari area was. This is from Isabella Bird. The mountain griddled plain of Gawar is a paradise of fertility, with abundant water, and has rich black soil capable of yielding 20 or 30-fold to the cultivator. There are over 20 Christian as well as some Muslim villages on Gawar, and a number of Kurdish hamlets and castles on the slopes in the folds of the hills above it. The sun was sinking as we embarked on the plain, and above the waves of sunset, gold, which flooded its rose, the icy spires and crags of the glorious Jilu ranges. You could tell that Isabella Bird has an eye for color and describing beauty. And this is one of the pleasures of reading her diary, is that she's able to be very descriptive, whereas other missionaries perhaps are not. Another feature that sets the tribal areas, the Hakkari areas, different from the plains areas are architectural features. In the plains, for example, to the right, you see a picture of a church of the East, which later becomes a Chaldean Catholic church in Mosul, Al-Tahira Church, and one in Tilkepe, for example. In the plains, architectural features are different than the mountains, than the Ashirat areas. In the mountains, the buildings are more rugged, dare I say, more primitive. There is a long history, a stability, an economic ability in the major cities of Nineveh, Mosul, Arbela, and other sites that have produced architectural creations on a larger scale than in the mountains. Architectural sites in the mountainous area are more primitive, they are hurried, it seems like, and on a much more smaller scale. A few years ago, I was speaking with a Turkish engineer who was in charge of building dams in the Hakkari area. And he had discovered a number of Assyrian buildings, and they were going to be endangered by the various dams that were going to be built. In other words, they were going to go underwater. And in speaking with him, he was very reluctant to speak with me because he thought we were preparing a lawsuit against the government of Turkey and felt that he should hire a lawyer to speak with me. But I convinced him, and eventually he was telling me that, these churches are very interesting, but I was struck. And he said, and initially we thought they were Armenian churches, and then I was just struck with how small they are. When we think of churches, we think of large buildings, very sort of ceremonial, large, ornamental type of buildings. But he said these churches in the mountains of the Hakkari, many times look like small rooms. And we're going to have references by missionaries to the same thing, that these are very small, humble places, dwelling places. So that's one thing that the mountainous area is different. Another major difference between the plains areas, and this includes Urmi, where the churches are larger. Part of it, of course, is the geographic setting where the plain lends itself to larger buildings. Another part is the monetary support or economic support for such buildings. Here we have an example of a house in Tiari. And this is from Badger and Historians and Their Rituals, just to give you kind of a glimpse of what these houses look like. Now, the political situation of the Assyrians in the Hakkari, again, keep in mind that there are pressures from the east, although the Ottoman Empire is much more powerful than the Qajar Iranian entity. The Assyrians in Hakkari are under the jurisdiction of the Emir, and these areas are slightly autonomous. There is an understanding between themselves and the Ottoman Porte, where these areas are less, let's say, centralized than they are going to be in the future. Certainly nothing like what we have today in either Turkey or in any other country. So the Assyrians in Hakkari are under the jurisdiction of the Emir, but various references tell us that is nominal jurisdiction. So the power is not that great, but are beholden to the Patriarch of the Church of the East, who later becomes a salaried Ottoman official. When does the Patriarch of the Church of the East become a salaried Ottoman official? It happens later in the 1800s. So we know, for example, Marru al-Shummun, after the Badr Khan massacres, becomes a salaried Ottoman official, as does Mar Binyamin Shummun in the Hakkari area. Tribes largely settle disputes among themselves and perpetuate violence on other tribes largely free from Ottoman interference. So the Ottoman officials do not come into these areas, partially because of the inaccessibility, geographic inaccessibility of these areas, partially because of the large-scale violence that might take place. So there's a great deal of fear for a lot of Ottoman officials, although many do penetrate these areas. Emirate of Hakkari had developed a flexible relation with Ottoman authority. Since the Assyrians and the Kurds shared power, it was referred to as a Muslim-Christian confederation. And at this time, I am studying a PhD dissertation by a student at Mardin University. And this is a kind of tough read because it's originally published in Turkish, but it is translated electronically in English. But he talks about and bases a large part of his dissertation on Ottoman archives. And he talks about the power arrangement made specifically in the Hakkari area between the Emir or Mira, as the Assyrians refer to such people, the Emir of the Emirate, or the prince, if we use another phrase, and the Marshumun, who becomes a tribal leader, in effect. He's the head of the tribes. Again, his power on the tribes is nominal. Now, I remember reading this quote a very long time ago, and it just stirred me so much because I never knew that the Assyrians of the Hakkari had such strong influence, at least made an impression on a British Captain Campbell here, Captain Sir John Nicol Robert Campbell, who is being quoted here by Eli Smith and Dwight in their book. And they tell us that Captain Campbell assured us that the Assyrians are by far the most powerful people of Hakkari, that they are much feared by the Kurds and will perhaps before many years be left by them in undivided possession of the country. He entertained a high opinion of their character. So we have one missionary, Ainsworth, who is very concerned about the attention Assyrians have received. And we have one or two who are saying that these people may dispossess the Kurds of this territory of Hakkari. So I want you to think from the descriptions that we have of the 1890s, not only of Urmi and other places, going back to the descriptions we have of the 1830s, such as what you see here by Eli Smith and Reverend Dwight. What happened? And we are going to go into a great deal of detail because that lesson, that tale, that story is going to be a very, very interesting one. Ashirats pay no tribute, not no tribute, pay no tribute. The Hakkari country in the center of which the Patriarch resides and of which Julma is the capital, is the heart of Kurdistan, and consists of almost inaccessible mountains. By the way, this term Kurdistan is a reference to a land, so it's not an official reference to a designated country. It's just the land, as if you refer to the Zagros Mountains, for example. The Assyrians who inhabit it are called Ashirat, a term which the bishop today explained as meaning a people who do not pay tribute. They are, in fact, he said, independent, and not only pay no tribute themselves, but exact tribute from the Kurds who live among them. Again, this is the situation in the 1830s, and this situation is going to change in the future. The Maliks of the Hakkari tribes, of which there are 6 in the Hakkari Mountains, Lower Tiari and Upper Tiari have 2 separate Maliks, and Jilu has 1, although oftentimes there's conflict, but this is not the subject here today. The temporal power in the hands of the distinct Maliks, but they all acknowledge the authority of the Patriarch. He estimates their number at 50,000 families. Again, these are guesstimates. No one knows the exact number. It could be more, but we don't know. These are references by Eli Smith and Dwight. The Chaldean priest at Khosrawa in Salama said that the independent districts are deep valleys shut in almost impassable mountains of Kurdistan. Each has its own Malik or Maliks who acknowledge subjugation to no common head. They are elected for life by the popular voice irregularly expressed, and the office is often, but not always, hereditary in the same family. And many times we referred to this, that the Maliks would often come from a particular family, and it would pass on, this tradition would pass on, the succession from one Malik to another would pass on in the family for possibly for centuries. Cultural features and stereotypes. I was talking with Sarah today, and I said I hope no one takes any offense at some of the comments that I make, but these are among Assyrians themselves and among various missionaries. We see this various expressions. Mountaineers are perceived to be more warlike, independent, and less refined, derogatorily. There's an expression among them, Assyrians themselves, the Batura. Of course, that's a derogatory term. I don't need to tell you that. Mountain bears. People of the plains tend to be more submissive or more cultured. Derogatorily, they are referred to as sometimes by other Assyrians as well as less brave or cowardly. And now I don't say this because I mean it. I say this because there are stereotypes among Assyrians themselves. And there are many more, of course, having to do with tribes or groups of people. The patriarch's power is clothed properly, as Smith tells us, with only spiritual power. But this is partially true. There is the legitimacy of a religious leader and legitimacy of also later an official of the Ottoman Empire. And so he does hold sway. But in the 1830s, he has more spiritual power than he does later on. And what do I mean by that? When Marshamun, in his relations with the Mir of Hakkari, decides to create a bit of a greater influence for himself, let's say, vis-a-vis the Emirates. He meets with opposition not only from the Kurdish emirs, but also from some of the maliks of his own people. And this, of course, is not going to turn out well, either for Marshamun himself or for the Assyrians as a whole. But we will get into that. It's important to know that, as we said, the lives of the people in Hakkari with low agricultural output, although they had military support, their weapons were not the best. The Kurds around them had better weapons. The Assyrians, nevertheless, although poor, were able to defend themselves. To complete the Diocese of Marshamun, we must add other districts in the same mountains subject to the Kurds, which means, for example, Salamis and Urmi also were under the rule of Marshamun, as was the area of Shemizdan, oftentimes referred to as Shaput, sometimes derogatorily. The whole contains, according to an estimated census given us by the same priest at Khosrawa, again in Salamis, in company with a Chaldean of his village who had traveled through the independent districts, an Historian population of 14,000 families, or about 70,000 souls. Well, you know, the estimates range between 70,000 and 120,000 and up to 150,000, some sources. And of course, this is an issue of contention. The numbers could be higher. The dialects spoken by the Assyrians in the Hakkari area largely could be classified as two, northern and southern, one could say, for simplicity's sake. And I would refer to them as either the Jilu or the Tiari dialect. And the Jilu includes Baz, Diz, Quchanos, and Salamis, because Salamis has many words in common, although it is north of Urmia, has many words in common with the Jilu or Baz dialect. And then the southern, the Tiari, Tkhuma, Barwar, and even similarly, the Nineveh Plain are very similar to each other in pronunciation. So, for example, in the northern dialect, house is either Bia or Beya. House in the southern dialect is either Betha or Besha or Beta, and so on. Lots of, obviously, much more complicated than that. But the Urmia dialect is slightly different. And the dialect of Shmizdan, which includes Marbishu and Nochia, and is also takes, I would say, from both the Tiari dialect and as well as the Urmia dialect in pronunciation of various words. The state of the economy of the Assyrian people during this time was in dire straits, very difficult. If we look at Salamis, for example, in the 1830s, Eli Smith tells us that the inhabitants own the soil they cultivate, though so hedged in by surrounding villages that their possessions are small. They pay a tax of 1,000 tumans, about $3,000 in money, and about half that amount in grain. So what this tells us is that the Aghas and the people in charge in these areas, whether Azaris or Kurds, made life extremely difficult under the reign of the Qajars or under various more autonomous bodies ruling the area of Urmia. We are told also by Smith that literacy is very difficult, and this passage I think is very interesting. In this village, there is no school, nor can any read. Now, this, remember, is before the American missionaries engage in a large-scale effort to create printing and schools and reading and reprinting of the Bible or translations of the Bible. This comes before. There's no school, nor can any read, except for himself, his father, and his two brothers. These are priests. But in two others, some children are taught by the priests. He confessed that none of the Assyrian females are taught letters. You, said he, can attend to such things, but we, both men and women, are obliged to labor with all our might to get money for the Muslims. Even if a boy sit down to read, a Muslim comes up before he is aware, and a blow upon his neck says, "Give us money." Seeing us smile at this remark, these are the missionaries describing, he seemed grieved and exclaimed with more earnestness, quote, "Why do you leave us thus? We are your brethren. It is your duty to come and deliver us from the yoke of bondage." He contended that no people in the world are so fond as learning as the Assyrians, but intimated that none except the candidates for the clerical profession actually receive any education. So although the Assyrians were hungry for education, unfortunately, during this time, there was none. And in large part, it's because of the persecution they faced. There was very clear oppression by the Aghas and by the people who were the landowners of this area. The oppression exercised by the Aghas consists in taking extra taxes, demanding labor without wages, and carrying off, something horrible here, Christian girls for their harems. The laws which affect Christians specially and injuriously are, one, that evidence of a Christian is not received against a Muslim, that if members of a Christian family becomes a Muslim, he or she becomes entitled to claim the whole property of the house, which is often as not consists of 2 or 3 families. The apostatizing member of a household is usually a girl who either falls in love with or is carried off by a young Mohammedan or Mohammedan who declares truly or falsely that she has embraced his creed. A good governor is careful in these matters and in some cases gives the girl only her share of the family property, but a bad governor may at any time carry out the law or use it as a means of extorting ruinous bribes. Every Christian man above the age of 16 pays a poll tax annually for exemption from military service, but from this impost, the headman of a village who is at once a tax gatherer and its spokesman is free. He ranks next to the priest and is treated by the villagers with considerable respect. I have found the Syrian or Assyrian koha as polite and obliging. Now, one thing I need to tell you that's very important to know, that over 100 years after this was written, and this is in the 1890s, over 100 years, in the year 2010, we have situations in Iraq, in the Kurdistan region, where a woman who runs off, let's say she has 2 children, she runs off with a Muslim man, leaves her husband, and is able under Iraqi law to claim. Hard to believe that this is true, but it's the case, and it was the case in Iran, and it was the case in Ottoman under Ottoman rule. Certainly the case in Iraq up until 2010, and continues to be the case today. She can come back and claim that the children are actually Muslim because she herself has converted and has the right to the possession of the children. So, as a Muslim who is entitled to have the children because the person who converts has a higher political right, the children automatically become Muslim under law. Now, that may not be the case in terms of the teaching of these children, but there are many cases of Assyrians in Iraq, for example, Assyrian Christians or other Christians in Iraq who by some twist of fate, for example, had a family member who became a Muslim, let's say a mother or a father. And they were children at the time. They were, 5, 6, 7 years old. And they became, quote unquote, they became by law, by an act of law, became Muslims. And they're going as young men or young women to claim their papers. They're what we refer to as Ahwal Madaniya in Iraq, which is a identity card. And they find that in the government registration office, they are registered as Muslims and not Christians. Well, they never knew they were Muslim, but by an act of law, they are in fact Muslims. So this is a very horrendous type of persecution, that legal persecution, that went on centuries ago and continues to be with us. And it's one of the reasons that of course you stop and think, why is the population much less? Is it just a matter of people having more children? Is the birth rate higher? No, it's also a system which is slated to favor one side versus another in every possible way. So whereas a Christian man, for example, even in today's Iraq, cannot marry a Muslim woman unless he converts, a Muslim man can, in fact, marry a Christian woman, even if she does not convert. That is okay. So a lot of these laws, I find it very interesting, being described by these missionaries, are in fact still with us today, after the age of enlightenment has long passed, supposedly. Isabella Bird also tells us, I write of Christians of Urmi, and it's plain Assyrians, because we now want to understand in terms of how did they understand their ethnicity? Well, based on the explanations given by these missionaries, who sometimes did not know really what we meant by the word Suraya or Suriyaya. I write of the Christians of Urmi, and it's plain Assyrians, because that is the name which they call themselves, Suraya. We know them at home as Nestorians, but it is a nickname given to them by outsiders. And I know of no reason why we should use a nomenclature which attaches to a nation the stigma of an ancient heresy. So here she tells us it's not appropriate to use Nestorians. The other word, of course, is Syrians. You'll still find authors today, such as Gordon Taylor, who talk about the Assyrians as being Nestorians. And even though this is not only not helpful, it's inappropriate, they still use it because they believe, well, it was used in the past, might as well continue. But here we see an interesting expression by what I feel is a moment of enlightenment on the part of Isabella Bird. They are sometimes called Chaldeans, which is true, and the present Archbishop of Canterbury has brought into currency the term Assyrians. Now, when she says this, obviously, she doesn't understand, unfortunately, which sometimes can be the case because the understanding of history is limited. And do not simply take this sentence and run with it. She does not understand that the word was also used in older sources, Aturaya, and she does not also understand that the word Suraya actually is connected to the word Asuraya or Aturaya. So, although she does understand that the people themselves call themselves Suraya and uses the word Syrian, she believes that the word Assyrian has come into currency really through the Archbishop of Canterbury. And of course, that's a misunderstanding of the true etymological connection between the word Suraya and Aturaya. The Muslims apply the name Nasara, and we've heard this before, solely to the Syrian Christians. They claim that Christianity was introduced among them by the Magi and their return from Bethlehem, on their return from Bethlehem. The highest estimate of their number is 120,000. So she is telling us in 1890 that their estimates are 120,000. Eli Smith and Dwight were telling us that the estimates of Assyrians are or were about 70,000 souls, quote unquote. The Persian Syrians inhabit the flat country, chiefly the plains of Urmi and Salamis, where the fertile lands are most carefully cultivated by their industry. So she reflects on the situation of the Assyrians. And I couldn't title this anything else than her own reflections. And she tells us that the Assyrian Christians, or the Christians, complain terribly of the way in which justice is administered. And doubtless nothing can be worse, but the Europeans say that the people bring much of its hardship upon themselves by their frightful litigiousness and their habit of going to law about the various trifles. Now, litigiousness here doesn't mean going to court all the time. Litigiousness means contentious relationships here between them. Intense avarice seems to be a characteristic of the Assyrians of the Persian plains, and they fully share with other Orientals the failings of untruthfulness and untrustworthiness. Now, many people would say, okay, anecdotal evidence, and keep that in mind. This is a person who's, believes she has the truth, but she obviously observed something, and we cannot say that she did not. But to paint a broad brush, as it were, on all Assyrians, you got to take it with a grain of salt here. They are said to be grossly ignorant and superstitious. And of course, this is a major point of contention for the missionaries when it comes to the Assyrians. They look at their culture and their habits concerning faith, and they think that this is ignorance and superstition. And the abuses and the unutterable degradation of their church perpetuate all that is bad in the national character. The women are spoken of as chaste, and some of the worst forms of vice are happily unknown among the Assyrians. Oh, that's good observation, but though they are practiced by the Muslims around them. So she has this view that although the Muslims are bad, the Assyrians are good, so kind of black and white situation. Obviously, again, let's take that with a grain of salt and understand that her stereotyping is done for a reason. She's a missionary or is concerned with missionary activity and understands things from that perspective rather than a culturally nuanced perspective. Their hospitality, their sufferings for the faith, and their family attachment are justly to be reckoned among their virtues. So she sees that as a big plus on the part of the Assyrians. But on the whole, I think that the extraordinary interest, so here we go, what's the interest in these people? Attaching to them, and which I feel very strongly myself, is due rather to their past than to their present. And that's very important to know. When it came to many of these missionaries, really what they were thinking about is how glorious was the ancient church, this remnant of Christianity, this very important. Now, remember, we're not talking about military planners here. Later, we're going to discuss the First World War and see if there's use for these people, not just the fact that they belong to an ancient Christian remnant, or remnant of an ancient church, but what use could they be against, for example, the Ottoman Empire? That comes later. The Christian population of the city is not very large, though it's estimated that there are, again, 20,000 Christians in the villages of the plain. The city dwellers are mostly well-to-do people who have come into Urmi to practice trades. The best carpenters, as well as the best photographers and tailors, are Assyrians. And though in times past Muslims refused to buy from the Christians on the ground that things made by them are unclean, the prejudice is passing away. So this is another observation which we may attach some truth to, depending on the sources we look at, but again, very difficult to determine. I found this passage a very interesting one by Eli Smith and Dwight when they visited an Assyrian church. They were very unimpressed, like the Turkish engineer that I told you about, with the size of these churches, and quite taken aback with these humble buildings, small buildings. But these were sacred places to the Assyrians, and they were very, very important to them and very sanctified. The church was a small, dark, vaulted room entirely destitute of pictures or any kind of ornaments, except coarse shawls, which covered the reading desks. These were 2 blocks of stone on either side of the entrance to the sanctuary, and supported by books from which service was read. Between them and the sanctuary was a narrow space extending from side to side of the building and enclosed by a wall 4 or 5 feet high. The sanctuary itself seemed half as large as the church and was connected with it, by a single door. Opposite the door, on the farther side of it, stood the altar, a plain block stone. After looking for a moment at a plain stone trowel, which served for a baptismal font, I observed that a door conducted into the sanctuary and was about to enter. So this missionary doesn't understand that there is sacred place in the Assyrian church that you cannot enter. I told him that I was, but the bishop commanded me in an authoritative tone to stop. So you can imagine this bishop saying, no, do not enter there. Although they were very nice to the missionaries, although Assyrians welcomed Westerners, although in all cases they were extremely friendly to them, they had their brightest of red lines, as it were. You do not desecrate the sacred. I told him that I too was a priest, but he replied that places can be entered only by fasting, and betrayed by his manner such earnestness that I desisted. So you cannot enter a sacred place unless you fast and unless you are a true priest. Now, the missionaries had a place among the Assyrians, and we are going to explore that very carefully in the next lecture. A German traveler and archaeologist, Friedrich Schultz, discovery of the Assyrians in 1829. Of course, this was before Eli Smith created a stir in the West, and this is what initially was a concern of Ainsworth. By the way, Schultz was an archaeologist who was murdered, largely, it is thought, by the orders of Nur-Allah, the Emir of Hakkari. So Catholics, Anglicans, and American Presbyterians, among others, came to Hakkari to make contact with the Assyrian people. Marshamun chose the British over the others to have a relationship, and a formal connection was established with the Anglican Church. Before the First World War, Reverend Brown, a British missionary, lived in Qutanas for more than 25 years in his capacity as an Anglican Church representative. And there you see Reverend Brown, for some strange reason, wearing his cap and gown in Qutanas. Well, that's what they wore to show kind of their intellectual ability vis-a-vis the Easterners. And he stayed. By the way, this photograph is from marshamun.com, reproduced from a Thomas Burckhardt Berlin Ethnology Museum, 1894. Because the Assyrians experienced so much hardship, especially in the 1890s, and especially after the period of the conflicts with the Kurdish emirs, they thought that, quote unquote, the Lord is deaf to their pleas. Among the guests who come and go as they please, unquestioned, are the refugees from the barbarities of the Kurds. Among the most pitiable, whom is Mar so-and-so, does not give his name, bishop of such and such a place. Bereft under threat of death of his episcopal seal and a fugitive from his diocese, which is almost destroyed by violence and exactions. Few hours pass in which some fresh tale of bloodshed or the carrying away of flocks or the attacking of travelers or the digging into houses is not brought up here. A piteous state of alarm prevails. Marshamun, naturally feeble and irresolute. Now, this is in the 1890s, and his family councils are helpless. His dual position aggravates his perplexities. Councils are divided and paralyzed. No one knows where to turn for help on earth. And, quote, the Lord is deaf, end of quote, some of the people say. Now, did missionaries make things better? At the time, Isabella tells us, when the first American missionaries settled in Urmi, the yoke of Islam was hardly bearable. The Christians were oppressed and plundered, and their daughters were taken by violence, and they were scarcely allowed to practice the little religion left to them. The Persian government, or the Iranian government, sensitive as it is to European opinion and looking for profit from them, has gradually remedied the state of matters upon which reports of the missionaries were justly to be dreaded. And at the present time, the Christians of Urmia and the adjacent plain have comparatively very little to complain about. Well, is that true in the 1890s? I would say the situation improved and got worse depending on who was in power and what was going on and what type of raiding was taking place. Certainly the situation among the Ashirats, unlike in the case of Urmi and Salamas and the plain of Gawar, for example, as well as the Nineveh plain, was different. People were forced to become submissive to the governmental authorities, and because of the religious differences, they were forced to become second or third class citizens in type of a status that was practiced in Europe in the system of feudalism. Now, when we talk about American missionaries being either good or bad, we should understand that in some cases there was conflict caused. In some cases it was perhaps inadvertent. In some cases it was extremely negligent. I don't think we can point to any specifically intentional act on the part of any missionary when it came to the interests of the Assyrians. However, we will discuss Asahel Grant, Reverend Asahel Grant, who wrote The Nestorians or the Lost Tribes, talked about the Assyrians, and who was involved with Badr Khan and Nurullah, as well as Marshamun, and who experienced many of the trials and tribulations of the Assyrians during these times. And after the 1843 and 1846 massacres, things turned much for the worse, much, much worse for the Assyrians. So we will discuss those in the next lecture and understand what exactly happened with the Assyrians in 1843 and 1846.